Magavan and Tolkien nerds, and welcome to another Luminarie, where this week we'll be mainly talking about Arwen. Now, this is a pretty interesting topic because on the face of it, it's quite straightforward. She falls in love with Aragorn, and all the elves leave Middle-earth, and then she eventually dies. But why? Because there's quite a lot of lore and history surrounding elven mortality and practices of marriage that we can go into, which really flesh out who she is and what happens surrounding her decisions of mortality and marrying Aragorn. So, those of you who've only seen the movies, they don't really do a great job of explaining what's going on. It's not a slice on Peter Jackson. It's a really complicated topic that Tolkien really thought about and really fleshed out and really went into, and then published very little of it. And most of what we have about the marriage practices of the elves, it comes from the history of Middle-earth, which was collected by Christopher Tolkien after the professor died. The main point is that with the complexity of these marriage topics and the topics of mortality, getting it across in a movie without tons of exposition would be really, really, really hard to do. So I think, as I recall, she promises to Aragorn and immediately seems to start fading, and that's quite wrong for quite a few reasons we'll get into later. One of the major reasons it's off is because most of this happens actually before Frodo even sets off. So who is Arwen? Her father, of course, is Lord Elrond Half-Elven of Imladris, called Rivendell in the common tongue. She has two older brothers, Elladan and Elrohir, who spend a lot of time with the Rangers in the north. They're good friends of Aragorn. She was born in the year 241 of the Third Age. Her brothers were born as twins in the year 130, so they are 111 years older than she is. She's the youngest of the family. She meets Aragorn in Imladris in the year 2951, when she is 2,710 years old, and he is 20, the little cougar. She has the name Undomiel, which means even star in Elvish. Now, we don't hear much about her mother at all in the films, but her mother is Celebrian, who was the daughter of Galadriel. And of course, as a daughter of Galadriel and Celeborn, she must have been a very mighty and beautiful elven maiden. But sadly, she was captured and tortured by orcs and given a poison wound. So she sails off to the west into the Undying Lands in the year 2510, 440 years before Aragorn meets her. And of course, the union of Elrond and Celebrian brought forth the likeness of Luthien again to the mortal lands. Of course, Luthien was the beautiful elven maiden, described as the most beautiful elf ever to have lived. And of course, Beren meets her and just falls head over heels in love with her. And that is how beautiful Arwen's supposed to be. She's supposed to be literally just the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. And of course, she was played perfectly by Liv Tyler, who is also quite the babe. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen this meme floating around of when Liv Tyler meets Aragorn. This is Aragorn. She'll be staying with us in Rivendell for a little while. No one's all like that. But really, it's much more like this. Aragorn. This is Arwen. So, yeah, it's a lot more like that, really. Eyes, wolf whistle, and heart beating. And there's a much more kind of sensible picture there with them. So we'll go with that in a little while. So I'd like to read from you from the appendices of the Return of the King. This is my all-in-one nice big chunky book. So, the next day at the hour of sunset, Aragorn walked alone in the woods, and his heart was high within him, and he sang, for he was full of hope, and the world was fair. And suddenly, even as he sang, he saw a maiden walking on the greensward among the white stems of the birches, and he halted, amazed, thinking that he had strayed into a dream, or else that he had been received the gift of the elf minstrels, who can make things of which they sing appear before the eyes of that listen. For Aragorn had been singing part of the Lay of Luthien, which tells of the meeting of Luthien and Beren in the forest of Neldareth. And behold, there Luthien walked before his eyes in Rivendell, clad in a mantle of silver and blue, fair as the twilight in Elvenheim. Her dark hair strayed in sudden wind, and her brows were bound with gems like stars. For a moment Aragorn gazed in silence, But fearing that she would pass away and never be seen again, he called to her, crying, Tinuviel, Tinuviel, even as Beren had done in the elder days long ago. And the maiden turned to him and smiled, and she said, Who are you, and why do you call me by that name? And he answered, Because I believe you to be indeed Luthien Tinuviel, of whom I was singing. But if you are not she, then you walk with her likeness. So many have said, she answered gravely, and yet her name is not mine, though maybe my doom will not be unlike hers. Who are you? And we hear that very loaded sentence. Maybe my doom will not be unlike hers, because of course in the first stage Luthien swore her life to Beren, and she chose to stay with a mortal lover and died as a mortal. So all this happens, as I mentioned, when Aragorn is but 20 years young. And Aragorn puts his suit to Lord Elrond, who basically says, You're too young to discuss this now, we'll put some years on it and talk again later. So Aragorn goes off, adventuring in the south and east, and he goes right to the edge of Mordor, and comes back when he's 49 to Lothlorien on the other side of the Misty Mountains. Galadriel takes him in, and this does feel a bit like a setup. She takes him in, gives him a bath and some noble silver and white clothes and a great grey elven cloak, and there he sees Arwen again on the hill of Caras Galadon, and he's walking towards her with some flowers. And let's take a look at that little scene. Where are we? 10:35. But Aragorn was grown to full stature of body and mind, and Galadriel bade him cast aside his way-worn raiment, and she clothed him in silver and white, and a cloak of elven grey, and bright gem on his brow. Then more than any king of men he appeared, and seemed rather an elf lord from the Isles of the West. And thus it was that Arwen first beheld him again after their long parting, and as he came walking towards her under the trees of Caras Galadon, laden with flowers of gold, her choice was made and her doom appointed. So again, her doom appointed. I'm going to go a little bit further actually, because this is also where they give their troth to each other. So then for a season they wandered together in the glades of Lothlorien, until it was time for him to depart. And on the evening of midsummer, Aragorn, Arathorn's son, and Arwen, daughter of Elrond, went to the fair hill, Ceren Amroth, in the midst of the land. And they walked unshod in the undying grass, with Elenor and Nifredil in the twilight, and they plighted their troth, and were glad. And that's when they officially engaged themselves to each other. But it has that moment, and her doom was appointed. Now, Ceren Amroth is the ancient heart of Lorien, just north of Caras Galadon, which is where the Lord and Lady of their house. And it's shortly after this that Arwen starts making his Banner of Kings, which is Elladan and Elrohir give to him before they go into the path of the dead, and he unfurls it in the Pelennor fields. But it's basically, this is where she's decided to live as a mortal. Now, on the face of it, it's easy to think that she may have been swept off her feet by this dashing, brave and noble son of kings, but that's really not the case. I'm going to go into a little bit of the history of Middle-earth for some insights into the wedding customs of the Eldar. Now, in normal times, the engagement and betrothal would be signified by the giving of silver rings, and it would last for a year, during which time the rings can be revoked. And if the rings are revoked, if the betrothal is called off, they take the silver rings, beating up my house, they take the silver rings and they melt them down, and they're not allowed to use them again for anybody else. And that is in Morgoth's Ring. So, where are we? Very good book. According to the laws of the Eldar, this betrothal was bound then to stand for 1 year at least, and it often stood for longer. During this time it could be revoked by a public return of the rings, and the rings were then molten and not used again for betrothal. Such was the law, but the right of revoking was seldom used, for the Eldar do not err lightly in such choice. They are not easily deceived by their own kind, and their spirits being masters of their bodies, they are seldom swayed by the desires of the body only, but are by nature constant and steadfast. So there's very little kind of acts of lust or anything like that, because their spirits, their hearts are in control of their physical flesh. So there's none of these like cries of crimes of passion and all that sort of stuff that us mere mortals keep falling into. And also that line, not easily deceived by their own kind, I think is quite key, because of course Aragorn is part elven, so they have this mental connection between their spirits that their bodies are kind of following. So rather than her seeing him and being swept off her feet, of course that happens to him when he's 20. He sees her and he's like, she's gorgeous. But with her, she can see that he's this greater being. He has this pride and strength that goes beyond his mere body, and they have this spiritual connection a lot stronger than just a physical one. So yes, so normally the year would pass, they get engaged, they give each other the silver rings, and then after the year they'd set their wedding date, and then they'd have a big celebration, and they'd exchange those silver rings for gold rings, which they would then wear on their index finger. Now, there's another neat little tie-in to Lord of the Rings, which goes straight over your head the first time you read Lord of the Rings, because you don't know any of this. Because there's another bit, which is where, at the wedding, the mother of the bride would give the groom a gift. And, of course, Celebrian died, so Arwen's mother has died. But when the Fellowship is departing Lothlorien, Aragorn gets given 2 presents by the Lady of Lorien, an enchanted sheath for Anduril and a gem. So you've got to go back to Return of the King. Return of the King, page 365. Tons of bookmarks. So here is the gift of Celeborn and Galadriel to the leader of your company, she said to Aragorn, and she gave him a sheath that had been made to fit his sword. It was overlaid with tracery of flowers and leaves wrought of silver and gold, and on it were set in elven runes formed of many gems the name Anduril and the lineage of the sword. The blade that is drawn from this sheath shall not be stained or broken, even in defeat, she said. But is there aught else that you desire of me at our parting? For darkness will flow between us, and it may be that we shall not meet again, unless it be far hence upon a road that has no returning. And Aragorn answered, Lady, you know all my desire, and long held in keeping the only treasure which I seek. Yet it is not yours to give me, even if you would, and only through darkness can I come to it. Yet maybe this will lighten your heart, said Galadriel, for it was left in my care to be given to you, should you pass through this land. Then she lifted from her lap a great stone of clear green, set in a silver brooch, that was wrought in the likeness of an eagle with outspread wings, and as she held it, the gem flashed like the sun shining through the leaves of spring. This stone I gave to Celebrian my daughter, and she to hers, and now it comes to you as a token of hope. In this hour take the name that was foretold to you, Elisar, the Elfstone of the House of Elendil. So, she gave the Elfstone to Celebrian, her daughter, and it was going to be given to Aragorn, but of course Celebrian passed over the sea following her torture and wound by the orcs, and Galadriel gives it to him instead. So finally, of course, it all carries on in the year 3019. Sauron is overthrown in March, and Aragorn and Arwen are married on June 21st. And the last day of the Third Age of the Elves is March the 29th of 3021, when the last of the Ringbearers leave Middle-earth. And of course, Arwen, now choosing mortality, decides to stay in Middle-earth when all the other elves leave. Then in the year 120 years of his rule, Aragorn is feeling the years quite heavily. He's over 200 years old now, and he decides to lay down his life so that his son Eldarion, named after a character in the Finnish Tales, a great captain of the Númenórean ships, may take over. And there's a bit of discussion about Aragorn's lying on his deathbed, and he wants to pass on, and she's obviously very sad now. Estelle, she cries, and with that, even as he took her hand and kissed it, he fell into sleep. Then a great beauty was revealed in him, and all who after came there looked on him in wonder, for they saw that the grace of his youth, and the valour of his manhood, and the wisdom and majesty of his age were blended together. And long there he lay, an image of the splendour of the kings of men, in glory undimmed before the breaking of the world. But Arwen went forth from the house, and the light of her eyes was quenched, and it seemed to her people that she had become cold and grey as nightfall in winter that comes without a star. Then she said farewell to Eldarion and to her daughters, and to all whom she had loved, and she went out from the city of Minas Tirith, and passed away to the land of Lorien, and dwelt there alone under the fading trees until winter came. Galadriel had passed away, and Celeborn was also gone, and the land was silent. There at last, where the Malorn leaves were falling, but spring had not yet come, she laid herself to rest upon Ceren Amroth, and there in her green grave, until the world is changed, and all the days of her life are utterly forgotten by men that come after, and Eleanor and Nifedil bloom no more east of the sea. Which is really, really, really bloody sad. So, of course, because the Age of Elves is gone now, because we're in Tolkien's world, we're in the Fourth Age now. The Age of Elves is gone, and we're now in the Fourth Age, which is the Elves of the Age of no magic and no elves. So, if you want to indulge me a little longer as to how mortality and all that sort of stuff works in Tolkien, the elves you've got the Fëa and the Hroa, and the Fëa is the spirit, and the Hroa is the body. It's a little bit more complex than that, but that's largely it. Now, elves are immortal in that the Hroa, the body, doesn't age and won't die unless injury happens to it. And if they are killed, their Fëa, their spirit, goes back to the Undying Lands, and it can live in the halls of Mandos. Mandos is like their lord of justice, and also the lord of the dead. He looks after the spirits. So, if your Hroa is destroyed, your spirit, your Fëa, will go back to the halls of Mandos. And then what can also happen is they can be reborn. And that's how Glorfindel, who's the hero of Gondolin, he dies fighting Balrog, but then he's also back in Middle Age, in the third age of Middle Earth, to save Frodo from being attacked by the Nine Riders at the Ford of Bruinen. So there is the discussion: is Arwen actually Luthien reborn? We've got to say no, though. Even though Aragorn suspected it for a moment, we can't say that she is, because after the spirit is reborn into a new body, what happens is when the elf is conceived, a little part of the Fëa of the mother and a little part of the Fëa of the father goes into the little baby. But then also what would happen is the Fëa from Mandos would be sent in as well, and then the baby would be born, learn to walk and learn all his words and learn about the world, and then there'd be an awakening in about the 30th or 40th year, and he'd remember all the previous memories from his previous life as well. And of course, as Arwen is 2,700 years old, that would already have happened. So she may be the spitting image physically of Luthien, but she's not Luthien reborn. So what happened to Arwen's Fëa after she died? Well, all we can assume is that because she chose to be mortal, her spirit would go to wherever the spirits of men go, and that is the big mystery of Middle-earth. We know where the elf spirits go, but nobody knows where the mortal spirits go. So there you go, that's the big mystery. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do me a favour and like and subscribe, and I shall see you again next week.